Story 1. Fear starts small. You think you can ignore it, but if you're not careful, it takes over everything. I didn't understand that until the night something I said as a joke came back to me in the worst possible way. I was about 14 at the time. A group of us went walking with some of my friends' parents through the scrubland near our village. We'd done it before, just wandering along the dry trails, talking, kicking rocks, nothing special. That evening felt normal, until we stumbled across something that instantly froze everyone. Lying just off the path was the carcass of a wild boar, or at least what was left of it. The flesh had rotted away, leaving mostly bones, and it was almost intact, like someone had just stripped the animal clean and set the skeleton down whole. Even the skull was still attached. For some reason, instead of being creeped out like I should have been, I thought it was funny. I picked up the skull, held it in my hands and started making a scene, pretending to threaten people with it. I shouted dumb stuff, laughing, about eating them. Everyone groaned or laughed it off, but I kept it going longer than I should have. Eventually, I tossed it back onto the pile of bones and walked away like it was nothing. We didn't stay out much longer. It got dark quickly, and we all headed home. By the time I got inside, I was wiped out. I remember feeling unusually tired, more than I should have from just walking around, and instead of showering or even really saying goodnight, I just collapsed into bed. Normally, I'd scroll through my phone or read, but not that night. I was out within minutes. At some point, I woke up. The room was hot, and I was drenched in sweat, but not the kind you get from a stuffy night. It was cold sweat, the kind you feel before throwing up or passing out. My skin was clammy, my heart was racing, and I had this wave of nausea that made me think I was about to get sick. I wanted to sit up and go tell my mom something was wrong, but when I tried to move, I couldn't. My head and my fingers twitched, but the rest of my body felt pinned. My elbows felt like someone was pressing down on them, my chest like there was a heavy stone across it, and no matter how much I tried, I couldn't push myself up. That's when I realized I wasn't just paralyzed. I was struggling to breathe. My chest rose in shallow gasps, each one harder than the last, and my vision blurred at the edges like I was about to faint. Panic kicked in, and I started to cry. In my head, the only explanation that made sense in that moment was that someone had broken into my room. I thought a stranger was sitting on top of me, holding me down, and I was too weak to fight back. Then came the worst part. I heard something in my head, not out loud, not with my ears. It was more like a thought, except it wasn't mine. The words were sharp and mocking, repeating the same thing I had said hours earlier while holding that skull. It told me it was going to eat me. Over and over, the same phrase, like someone was inside my head, using my own voice but twisting it. The words didn't sound external, but they didn't feel like they belonged to me either. They just filled my mind until it was all I could hear. I tried to fight it, tried to scream, but nothing came out except a strained whimper. The pressure on my chest grew worse until I thought I'd pass out, and then, nothing. It's like I blacked out. I don't remember falling asleep. 1 second the voice was hammering inside my skull, and the next I was waking up in the morning, light streaming through my window as if nothing had happened. At first I tried to convince myself it was just sleep paralysis. I'd read about it before, waking up but not being able to move, feeling pressure, hearing things that aren't there. It fit mostly, except for how it lined up with what I'd said earlier that evening. The words I'd shouted as a joke weren't random. They came back to me in the exact same way, except this time they were turned against me. That part I can't explain away. For days after, I felt uneasy in my room. Every time I closed my eyes, I half expected to wake up frozen again with that same voice in my head. I kept thinking about the carcass, how fresh the bones had looked, how wrong it was to pick up the skull like that. It wasn't just stupid, it felt disrespectful, like I'd crossed some line without realizing it. People can say it was a coincidence that my brain just latched onto the last memorable thing from the day and replayed it in a nightmare. Maybe that's all it was, but it didn't feel like a dream. It felt targeted, like whatever I had done that evening had followed me home and decided to show me how serious it was. I used to laugh at people who talked about ghosts or curses or spirits. I always figured there was a scientific explanation if you looked hard enough. After that night, though, I stopped dismissing people so quickly. I don't know what really happened to me, but I know how it felt. And sometimes the feeling alone is enough to make you believe. Story 2. I was a freshman in high school when my mom and I settled into that rental. It wasn't a bad place, just old and a little creaky. The kind of house where you expect the pipes to groan and the walls to shift when the wind pushes against them. I told myself from the start that I wouldn't let the noises get to me, because old houses always have their quirks. At first, everything was normal. School, weekends, sick days. It was all the same routine. But then I started noticing something that I couldn't write off as easily. Every single day, without fail, at exactly 1 o'clock in the afternoon, I would hear footsteps on the roof. Not light scurrying like a squirrel or the slow drag of tree branches. These were heavy, deliberate, and fast, like a person running. What made it even stranger was that the footsteps only ever came from directly above my room. I would sit there listening as they started in the back corner above me, then raced across in a straight line until they stopped right above the edge of the roof that overlooked the front yard. Then silence, like whoever, or whatever it was, had just launched off the edge. The first couple of times I tried to tell myself it was an animal, maybe raccoons or stray cats. But animals don't run like that in perfect, human-sounding strides. It was always 2 distinct feet hitting the roof, one after the other, pounding across the shingles. I counted once, and the rhythm was exactly what you'd expect from a grown man sprinting at full speed. No pauses, no scrambles, no skittering claws, just running. It happened so consistently that I started to dread 1 o'clock. I would check the clock, and like it was on a timer, the sound would begin. Sometimes I would even try to distract myself, turn the TV up loud or put on music, but I could still feel it through the ceiling, the vibration of the weight above me. There were even days when I swore dust shook loose from the rafters when the steps hit hard. I didn't tell my mom for a while, partly because I thought she would laugh it off, partly because I didn't want to admit how much it was bothering me. But after a few months, I couldn't keep it in anymore. I mentioned it to her one evening, half expecting her to say she'd heard it too. Instead, she just went quiet for a long moment before explaining that the landlord had told her something about the house's history. The story was that the previous owner had been a postal worker. According to what she'd been told, he used to come home from work and sit on the roof, almost like it was his routine. One day, though, things went badly. He climbed up there and jumped straight off the edge in front of the house, ending his life right in the yard. That hit me hard because it lined up perfectly with what I was hearing. The footsteps always started on the far side, ran across, and ended right where the drop would have been, every single time. My mom tried to soften it by saying maybe it was just the house settling in a weird way, or maybe birds were nesting inside the attic. But I had lived there long enough to know that wasn't it. These weren't random noises. They were footsteps. The more I thought about it, the more I noticed little things that I'd ignored before. The air in my room sometimes felt heavier in the afternoons, like it was harder to breathe until the noise stopped. I also started waking up at night with this odd sense that someone was standing outside, even though I never saw anyone through the window. Once when I was homesick, I swore I caught a shadow flicker across the ceiling just as the footsteps ended. It looked exactly like someone passing by outside the window, only I was on the second floor and there was no balcony. I can still remember how my stomach would tighten every day as the clock ticked closer to 1. No matter what I was doing, I would stop and wait for it, part of me hoping it wouldn't happen, part of me knowing it would, and it always did. Same rhythm, same path, same sudden stop at the edge. Eventually, I stopped trying to explain it to myself. The pattern was too exact, too human. It wasn't animals, and it wasn't the house settling. It was like whoever had been there before me was stuck in the same loop, reliving that final run every single day. I never saw anything more than shadows and never heard anything except those steps, but it was enough. I went into that house a skeptic, always looking for the reasonable explanation, but by the time we moved out, I didn't need convincing anymore. I believed. Story 3. When I moved into that flat, it didn't feel perfect, but I made it work. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. And after years of struggling, I was just glad to have a place where my kids and I could feel settled. The layout was odd. One bedroom was tucked downstairs near the entry, and the other was upstairs alongside the living room. To make life easier, I turned the living room into my own bedroom, so that both me and the kids could sleep on the same level. It felt safer that way, having them close. The first few weeks were normal. I was exhausted most nights. Balancing a newborn and a 4-year-old leaves little room for anything else. So I'd collapse into bed without a second thought. But one night, something different happened. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of breathing. It wasn't loud but steady, like someone was standing just a few feet away. At first I thought it was my son. He had a habit of crawling into my room, and I assumed he'd wandered in again. Still half asleep, I rolled over, expecting to see him curled up on the floor, standing near the bed. Instead, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed movement near the curtain. Someone was there, standing behind the fabric. Normally, I would have panicked. I should have jumped up, checked the doors, maybe even grabbed the phone to call someone, but I didn't. Instead, I felt this strange calm wash over me, almost like my body had been sedated, like nothing in the world could touch me in that moment. I sat up slowly, my heart strangely steady, and looked closer. The figure stepped forward, and I realized it wasn't my son at all. It was a boy, maybe around 15. His face looked ordinary, but his clothes were what caught my eye. He was dressed in what looked like an old-school uniform, dark blazer, white shirt, neat trousers. His expression wasn't threatening. If anything, he looked tired, as if he'd just walked a long way to get there. He told me his name was Tom. He explained that he had died in a fire, though he didn't go into detail. He didn't seem sad about it, more like he was stating a simple fact, the way someone might mention what street they lived on. I asked why he was there, what he wanted, but all he said was that he was just there. That was it, nothing else. The next thing I remember was waking up in the morning to the sound of my newborn crying to be fed. For a while I convinced myself it had been a dream, a very vivid dream, but still just a dream. I even laughed it off in my head, thinking that the stress of moving, the lack of sleep, and the constant exhaustion of parenting had probably cooked up something strange in my mind. But I couldn't shake how real it had felt. The calmness, the way the boy had looked, the weight of the whole interaction. It didn't feel like the usual chaos of a dream. And then, a few days later, I mentioned it to my mother. I said it in passing, not wanting to sound too serious, just joking that maybe the flat was haunted. Her reaction stopped me cold. She told me that a boy named Tom had died in the garages under the building a few years back. He had been trapped in a fire. She didn't remember the exact details, but she said he would have been about the same age I had described. That piece of information changed everything. What had seemed like a dream suddenly carried weight. I hadn't known anything about a boy named Tom before that. And to make it even stranger, when my eldest eventually started school, I became friendly with a woman whose last name rang a bell. It turned out she was Tom's sister. I never told her what I'd experienced. How could I? What would I even say? That I'd seen her dead brother standing by my curtain one night? I tried to reason it out afterward. Maybe I had heard whispers about the fire at some point and stored the information in the back of my mind. Maybe my brain stitched those details together into a dream, and that's why it felt so vivid. But no matter how many times I ran it through in my head, I couldn't shake the sense that it had been real. The calmness I felt that night is what really sticks with me. That wasn't normal. If a stranger had been standing in my room, curtain drawn or not, I should have been terrified. I should have grabbed my kids and run out of the flat. Instead, I felt almost like I was meant to see him, like the fear had been taken away so I could focus. Since then, I haven't dismissed strange experiences so quickly. I used to be the type who would laugh at ghost stories and insist there was always a logical explanation. And maybe there still is. Maybe the brain is powerful enough to create things that feel real when they're not. But after that night, I couldn't call myself a skeptic anymore. I don't tell this story often, mostly because I don't know what people will make of it. Some will say it was sleep paralysis, others will say it was just a dream. But for me, it was something else. I know what I saw, I know what I felt, and no amount of second guessing has ever taken that certainty away from me. Story 4. Back when I was younger, I spent a lot of nights at my best friend's house. His parents were easygoing, and his place was the hangout spot. On weekends, I usually ended up crashing on the floor of his room because we'd stay up too late playing games or watching movies. It was normal for me, nothing unusual, just another night away from home. This particular night, we'd gone to bed past midnight. He climbed into his bed, and I stretched out on the carpet with a blanket, close enough to see the glow from the hallway light seeping under the crack of the door. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of a fan, and I drifted off without much trouble. At some point, I woke up suddenly. I couldn't say what stirred me, but my eyes opened as if I had been nudged. The room was darker than before, the hallway light no longer visible. In the doorway about 10 feet away, there was a figure. At first I assumed it was just my friend messing around, maybe trying to freak me out. The shape was human, standing still, blocking the faint outline of the doorframe. I rolled over, half annoyed, and tried to ignore it. But then something struck me. I hadn't heard him move. His bed hadn't creaked, and there was no sound of footsteps. That thought nagged at me until I turned back for another look. What I saw then made my stomach tighten. The figure was no longer at the doorway. It was closer. The shape had taken on a faint glow, like a blue haze surrounding it, just bright enough that I could make out the form of arms and shoulders. My body locked up. I wanted to believe I was dreaming, but every detail felt too sharp, too real. Before I could process what was happening, the figure bent down over me. It didn't feel like a person leaning close. It was more like the air itself bent inward. I could see the glow clearer now. It was thin, almost translucent, but undeniably there. Then I felt it, a hand pressing onto my shoulder. The heat was immediate, not warm like body heat, but searing, like someone holding a heated object against my skin. It didn't burn, but it was overwhelming. My mind raced with every rational explanation I could think of. Maybe I was having sleep paralysis. Maybe my body was misfiring signals as I woke. But none of that explained how I could physically feel weight and heat on me, as real as anything I've ever felt. I wanted to move, to shake it off, but I was frozen. The pressure on my shoulder grew heavier, and I swore I could hear a faint hum in the room, low and vibrating, as though it was coming from the walls themselves. My breathing grew shallow, and all I could think was that I wasn't supposed to be awake for this, that whatever it was hadn't wanted me to notice. Then just as suddenly as it appeared, the figure was gone. The weight lifted. The heat faded. I sat up instantly, clutching my shoulder, and looked around. The doorway was empty, the room silent again except for the steady sound of the fan. My friend was still asleep in his bed, breathing slow and even, completely unaware of what had just happened a few feet away from him. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I lay there with my blanket pulled tight, staring at the ceiling, waiting for something else to happen. My shoulder still felt hot for hours afterward, like the sensation was burned into me. In the morning, I tried to brush it off. I told myself it was a dream or a trick of half waking, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. I had seen it. I had felt it. The logical part of me kept cycling through possible explanations: sleep paralysis, hallucination, stress. But none of those lined up with the raw physical detail of that moment. That night was the first time I ever believed in something beyond what I could explain. I went to sleep a skeptic, and by morning I was something else entirely. Someone who knew some things don't fit into neat, rational boxes, and no matter how much I want to convince myself otherwise, I'll never forget the heat of that hand pressing down on me, and the sense that something was watching long before I ever opened my eyes. Story 5. The woods where I grew up always made me feel small once I got deep enough inside. That's how it always felt walking through the land I grew up on in Kentucky. I'd spent years roaming those woods, hunting, fishing, and clearing paths. It was the last place I thought I'd ever question my own senses. But one evening out there changed all of that. I'd never really believed in monsters or spirits. I thought maybe there were animals people hadn't cataloged yet, and I even joked about Bigfoot with friends, but I didn't take any of it seriously. That changed after the night I decided to test out a new rifle setup. I'd bought my first AR-style rifle and paired it with a new magazine I was excited about trying out. I wasn't expecting anything except to get the sights dialed in. Instead, I got something that pushed me from skeptic to believer. The property I lived on was mostly thick woods, with a few paths made by cows along the creek. Beyond the creek, there was a big open field where I usually sighted in my guns. I knew every step of that land, so when I started down the path with my rifle, I didn't think twice. But the second I crossed the fence line into the deeper woods, I felt something I hadn't felt before. It was like invisible eyes locked onto me, tracking my every move. I brushed it off at first, telling myself it was just nerves or maybe a deer nearby. The farther I went, the stronger it got. The feeling wasn't vague, it was sharp, heavy, almost suffocating. By the time I was halfway to the field, I couldn't ignore it anymore. My hands went to the drum magazine I was carrying, and I started loading rounds into it. I'd only brought 20 rounds with me, since that was more than enough for sighting in, but my brain told me I needed them ready now. The second I began sliding the rounds in, the woods gave me my first sign. The air suddenly filled with the stench of something rotten. It was thick and sour, like meat left in the sun for weeks. I scanned the ground, and there it was, what was left of a possum, shredded apart in pieces. It didn't look like coyotes or dogs had gotten it. It was too clean in some spots and too brutal in others, as if it had been pulled apart by something with hands instead of teeth. It also didn't match the smell. The carcass looked fresh, maybe a day old, but the stink was like it had been decomposing for weeks. It felt placed there, like a message. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, but I pressed on, convincing myself I was just overthinking. By the time I reached the edge of the woods where the creek opened into the field, the pressure of being watched was unbearable. That's when I heard it, the sharp splash of something stepping into the water. I spun around, rifle ready though I hadn't chambered a round yet, and that's when I saw it. It stood across the creek, towering over the bank. At least 8 feet tall, but rail thin, like its bones might snap under its own weight. Its arms were long enough to hang below its knees, and every step it took looked unnatural. A weird half waddle, half stride. The skin stretched across its body was light brown, almost deer-colored, but wrong. Too smooth, too tight. It didn't make a sound as it moved, aside from the water splashing around its legs. No breath, no grunts, nothing. My chest locked up. My body screamed to act, and I hit the bolt release to chamber a round. That should have been it. The magazine was new, reliable, with a reputation for never failing, but nothing happened. The bolt slammed forward and stopped dead. The round stuck. I pulled, tapped, tried again, jammed solid. I couldn't get a single round into the chamber. The thing didn't lunge at me. It didn't roar or scream. It just stopped and stared, though it had no eyes I could see. Then in one fluid motion, it turned and walked away down the creek, disappearing into the trees without making another sound. One moment it was there, the next it was gone, like it had melted into the woods. I stood frozen until my legs gave out beneath me. When I finally got control again, I ran back to the house without stopping, magazine still jammed, rifle useless in my hands. That magazine never worked again, no matter how many times I tried to fix it. I ended up sending it back and claiming it was defective, but deep down I've always believed it wasn't a malfunction. Something made it fail at that moment. I've gone back to that field plenty of times since then. Nothing has ever happened again, and I've never felt that suffocating pressure of being watched the same way I did that night. But no matter how much I try to explain it away, some malformed deer, a shadow playing tricks, paranoia, I know what I saw. Something unnatural is in those woods. I didn't believe before. Now I'll never doubt again. Story 6. Back then, my life felt really repetitive. Same routine every day. But one train ride changed that. This was about 10 years ago, when I still prided myself on being the kind of person who scoffed at ghost stories. I considered myself logical, a skeptic through and through. Paranormal talk was something I'd roll my eyes at, but that train ride changed me, and I've never been able to shake it. I was heading upstate, sitting near the window with my headphones in, zoning out as the scenery passed by. It was a normal ride, half-empty car, the quiet hum of the tracks, nothing unusual. At some point, the doors between cars slid open, and in came a man who immediately caught everyone's attention. It's hard to describe him in a way that does it justice. His face looked exaggerated somehow, like the sharp features of a caricature, but in real life. His clothes were bright, mismatched, and filthy, layered in a way that made no sense, almost like he had pulled pieces from a costume shop. There was something skirt-like hanging off his waist, ragged and absurd. And then there was the smell. The stench hit the car instantly, so thick and sour it made my stomach turn. Everyone shifted uncomfortably, but no one said a word. He moved down the aisle slowly, unbothered by the looks. I remember holding my breath as he passed, counting the seconds until he reached the far end of the car. Eventually, he slid through the next set of doors, and the tension in the air seemed to ease. I let myself relax. Strange people pop up on trains all the time. This was just another odd encounter in a city full of them, except it wasn't. A few minutes later, the same doors slid open again, the very ones he had first entered through. And there he was, the same angular face, the same ridiculous outfit, the same suffocating smell. He stepped back into the car like the whole thing was starting over, shuffling down the aisle as though the last few minutes had been erased. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he had looped around somehow. Maybe I had lost track of time. But this was a single-decker train with one aisle. He had gone forward. There was no way he could have come back from behind without passing me. There were no side doors, no tricks. He had simply reappeared where he started. That's when my chest tightened and I felt myself panic. My mind started racing through wild explanations. Had he climbed outside the train, moved along the roof, and come back in? The thought was insane, but I had no better answer. The air in the car felt thick, almost suffocating, and I could see that the others had noticed it too. People glanced at each other, not speaking, but their expressions told me everything. They knew something was wrong. The man drifted through again, his smell lingering long after he left. Then once more, the doors shut. This time, though, no one looked relieved. It was as if we were all bracing ourselves for what came next. When the doors eventually opened again, I held my breath, expecting him. But the aisle stayed empty. Only the sound of the tracks filled the silence. The man never came back. I sat there frozen, running it over in my head. The déjà vu was too sharp, too exact, for me to dismiss as some lapse in attention. I knew I had seen him enter twice. I knew there was no physical way for him to have returned the way he did. And yet it happened, plain as day, in front of everyone. No one spoke a word, but the whole car seemed unsettled. I caught the eyes of a few passengers and saw the same puzzled, almost frightened look I must have been wearing. We all knew we had just witnessed something that shouldn't have been possible, but none of us wanted to break the silence by admitting it out loud. The rest of the ride felt endless. I kept waiting for him to show up again, for the doors to slide open and reveal that strange, angular face, but he never did. By the time I got off, my hands were shaking. I walked through the station in a daze, replaying the moment again and again, trying to force a logical explanation into it. All I know is that it happened, and it shattered the certainty I once had. Before that night, I laughed at the idea of the paranormal. Since then, I can't laugh anymore. I don't claim to know what I saw, but it was enough to make me question everything I thought I knew about what's real. Story 7. I used to stay at my grandmother's house in this small town in the Pacific Northwest. It was a big place with a strange history. Years before it had been built, the land was used as the county's poor farm. Back then, people who were homeless or had nowhere else to go could live there and work for food and shelter. Dozens, maybe even hundreds of people had passed through, and if you ask the older locals, they'll say that ground saw more than its share of hardship and death. I didn't think much about it at the time. To me, it was just my grandmother's place, old and creaky, but still standing. One summer night, the heat was unbearable. I went to bed with no sheets, trying to cool down. The air was thick and heavy, the kind of night where you wake up drenched in sweat. I remember stirring awake sometime past midnight, groggy and annoyed, planning to get up and use the bathroom. That's when I noticed something that made me freeze. In the corner near the closet, there was a shape. At first, it just looked like a darker patch against the already dark room. But the longer I stared, the more it seemed like a figure. My first thought wasn't ghost, it was intruder. I lived in a small town, but break-ins weren't unheard of, and the idea that someone could have been standing there the whole time while I slept vulnerable sent a jolt of fear through me. I tried to reason it out. Maybe it was just clothes piled up, or shadows playing tricks. But my body wasn't buying the excuse. My chest tightened, and my skin prickled like every nerve was screaming. My mind was racing through possibilities. If it was a person, what did they want? How long had they been there? What were they waiting for? Adrenaline kicked in. I decided that if someone was in the room, I'd rather confront them than stay frozen. I pushed myself out of bed, heart pounding, and made a run for the light switch. My only thought was that if I could get the lights on, I'd know for sure what I was dealing with. When I flipped the switch, the room lit up in an instant, and I saw him. Not a shadow, not a trick of the mind, a man. He looked to be in his late 50s or 60s, with a scruffy graying beard, piercing blue eyes, and wearing old-fashioned flannel and work clothes like a lumberjack. He was solid. I could see the folds of his shirt, the roughness of his face. For a second, my brain registered him as real, flesh and blood. Then right in front of me, he began to dissolve. It didn't happen slowly like someone walking away. It was like watching smoke fade into air. His face blurred, his body thinned, and within seconds he was gone, leaving nothing but the bare corner of the room. My heart was slamming against my ribs so hard it hurt. My first feeling was relief that it hadn't been a living person with a knife or worse. But that relief didn't last long because the alternative was worse. I had just seen something that by all logic shouldn't exist. The minutes after felt like hours. I stood there shaking, unable to crawl back into bed, afraid that if I shut the lights off, he'd come back. The house was dead quiet, but I swear the silence waited, pressing down on me. Eventually, exhaustion beat fear, and I sat up the rest of the night with the lamp on, staring at that corner until the sun came up. The next day, I couldn't stop replaying it. I tried to convince myself it had been sleep paralysis, some kind of between-dream state, but that didn't add up. Sleep paralysis keeps you frozen. I had moved, run across the room, and flipped a switch. Hallucinations don't show you details down to eye color, clothing, and expressions. I even sketched him out later that day because I wanted to remember exactly what I'd seen. For years, I'd enjoyed ghost stories the way some people enjoy horror movies. Fun to listen to, creepy, but not real. I thought everything had an explanation. Wiring in old houses, overactive imaginations, tricks of light. But seeing someone with my own eyes clear as day and then watching them vanish changed me in ways I can't fully explain. Even now, when I look back, I try to rationalize it. Maybe it was an incredibly vivid dream. Maybe I was overtired and my brain glitched. That's the skeptic in me, still clinging to the idea that there must be some explanation. But deep down, I know that night was different. That figure wasn't imagined. He was there, standing in the corner, watching. And when he dissolved, it wasn't like turning off a dream. It was like he'd been pulled away into somewhere else, somewhere just outside what we're supposed to see. That was the night I stopped being a skeptic. I don't go looking for proof anymore. I don't need to. I've already seen it, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. Story 8. There was this line of old, rusty mailboxes leading up to Preston Castle. They looked weird, all crammed together. Kinda creepy, honestly. Rusty, crooked, all clumped together like teeth too stubborn to fall out, they seemed to mark the beginning of something I probably shouldn't have wandered into. I had always been a skeptic when it came to ghost stories. Preston Castle had its reputation. Sure, old reform school, tragic history, plenty of urban legends. But to me, it was just another abandoned building that people like to exaggerate about. I figured the creepy stories were half the fun of going there. So one late afternoon, with no real plan and too much curiosity, I decided to take the drive. The place sat off by itself, surrounded by dry grass and trees that looked half dead even though it was midsummer. The road leading up to it was cracked and uneven, and that's when I noticed the mailboxes. Dozens of them, maybe 30 in a row, all clustered on the roadside like they were once meant for workers or families who lived nearby. Every one of them was shut tight, the little red flags all lowered. I remember thinking how odd it was that they hadn't been removed, but I didn't dwell on it. I parked just past them and got out. The air was heavy and still, and I could hear nothing but the crunch of gravel under my shoes. The castle itself loomed ahead, huge and skeletal, its windows dark like hollow eyes. I made my way toward the fence line, scanning for a decent spot to peek through or maybe slip past. The place was technically off limits, but plenty of people had been inside before, so I wasn't worried. That's when the first strange thing happened. From the trees just ahead of me, a massive rush of sound exploded all at once. Birds, hundreds of them, erupted from the branches, squawking, flapping, scattering in every direction. It wasn't the natural kind of noise you hear when you accidentally startle a few crows. This was deafening, like the entire tree line had been alive with wings, and I had set them off. The sky went black with them, and the sound of their wings beating against the air was so loud I had to cover my ears. My first thought was that maybe they were nesting there, and I'd disturbed them. Still, something about it didn't feel right. Birds usually break off in different directions and calm down once they're in the air. These didn't. They circled, dipped low, then vanished into the distance as if fleeing from something I couldn't see. I turned back toward the road, instinctively checking behind me, and that's when the second thing hit me like a punch to the chest. The mailboxes. Every single one of them, 30 in a row, was now standing wide open, each little door gaping, each flag raised straight up. I froze. I knew for certain they had all been closed when I parked. I had looked directly at them, and yet, in the few minutes I'd been walking toward the fence, they had all changed. I stood there staring, trying to make sense of it. Wind couldn't have done that. Even if a storm had blown through, the flags wouldn't all be up, the doors wouldn't all be open in perfect unison. My mind started racing, coming up with every possible explanation. Maybe a prank, maybe someone hiding nearby. But there was no sound, no movement, no one laughing or watching from the trees. Just silence, heavier now than before. I backed away slowly, the hairs on my neck standing up. My stomach felt like it was dropping, even though I was standing still. The castle didn't seem fascinating anymore. It felt like it was watching me, like I had crossed a line I wasn't supposed to. I didn't even bother with pictures. I got back in my car, locked the doors, and pulled away so fast I nearly tore the bumper off on the uneven pavement. The whole time I couldn't bring myself to look in the rearview mirror because I didn't want to see if those boxes were still open, or worse, if something else was standing there instead. When I finally got back into town, I tried to calm myself down with rational explanations. Maybe I had missed someone working on the mailboxes, though that didn't explain the flags. Maybe I'd imagined them being shut, though I knew that wasn't true. And maybe the birds had been nothing more than bad timing, though the sheer number of them felt unnatural. That's the thing about experiences like this. You tell yourself there's a reasonable answer because the alternative makes your skin crawl. But every time I think back to that line of mailboxes opening in unison, I can feel the same sick twist in my gut I felt that day. It didn't matter if there was a logical explanation waiting somewhere out there. In that moment, all I could think was that something had been trying to get my attention, and it had worked. I've never gone back to Preston Castle. I won't even drive near that road anymore. For me, that was the line between skepticism and belief. I can laugh off ghost stories all day, but I know what I saw, and I'll never forget how it felt, standing in front of a building that seemed to breathe, while 30 silent mouths opened all at once. Story 9. Working nights is weird. Feels like you're stuck while everyone else just keeps living their lives. You just wait for morning to come. That's how it felt when I started covering overnight renovation shifts at the restaurant I managed a few years back. I needed the money, so I didn't complain, but juggling 10 p.m. to 7 a.m. shifts and then opening up again after a nap wasn't exactly easy. The building itself was old, downtown Savannah, the kind of place where history feels like it seeps through the bricks. People always mention the tunnels beneath, supposedly once used during yellow fever outbreaks. Tour guides loved to point at our corner and tell spooky stories to their groups. The staff played along too. They called the supposed ghost Peter, joking that he was responsible for misplaced items, flickering lights, or random noises. I never bought into it. I figured old pipes, faulty wiring, and careless employees explained everything just fine. One particular night, I was helping a contractor update the sound system. By around 5 in the morning, the two of us were wrapping things up. The air in the restaurant felt heavy, like the night had stretched too long. The contractor asked me to run a walkthrough while music played to test the speakers. It sounded easy enough. I plugged my phone into the system, turned up the volume, and started walking through each section of the restaurant. The music filled the empty space, bouncing off walls that usually echoed with customers' voices and clinking glasses. For a while, it almost felt normal, like the place wasn't under construction, but just waiting for the next crowd to walk in. Then the first strange thing happened. As I passed by the bar, the overhead lights flickered. Not a quick pulse like a bulb about to go, but a long, slow dim, as though something was pulling the energy out of the room. The hair on my arms stood up, but I kept moving, telling myself it was old wiring reacting to the sound system being tested. Halfway through, that's when the noise came. From the kitchen, there was this sudden explosion of sound. Metal clattering, loud bangs, and the distinct crack of something ceramic shattering. It was so violent that I jumped, nearly dropping my flashlight. I cursed under my breath, thinking the vibration from the music must have knocked over some precarious stack of pans. I rushed back to shut off the music, and the silence that followed was almost worse than the noise itself. But I could still hear the faint echo of something settling, like a bowl spinning on tile before coming to a stop. The contractor came upstairs from the basement, wide-eyed, saying he'd heard the crash too. We both headed into the kitchen. What we found didn't make sense. Nothing was out of place. Not a single pan had moved, not one dish was broken. Every shelf and hook looked exactly as it had when we'd started the shift. I even checked the floor for shards, convinced I must have missed something, but there was nothing. The room smelled faintly of iron though, sharp and metallic, almost like blood. We looked at each other, both waiting for the other to explain it. I wanted to say it was the sound system vibrating through the walls, but the volume hadn't been that high, and ceramic doesn't shatter without leaving a trace. The contractor muttered something about old buildings making strange noises, but his voice didn't sound convinced. We decided to call it a night. Neither of us lingered. As I shut off the lights, I felt like the darkness rushed in faster than usual, swallowing up the glow before the bulbs had even cooled. Locking the front door, I couldn't shake the sensation that something was still inside, watching us leave. The next morning, after a couple of hours of sleep, I came back to open the restaurant. Sunlight poured in through the front windows, making the place look harmless again. Still, I couldn't stop myself from walking straight to the kitchen to check. Everything was still exactly as it had been, neat, orderly, untouched. If anyone else had been there, they would have thought I was making the whole thing up. For weeks, I kept trying to come up with a rational explanation. Maybe the sound carried weirdly through the tunnels. Maybe my exhaustion made me imagine it louder than it was. Maybe I just wanted an excuse to believe something strange had happened. But deep down, I know I didn't imagine it. I heard what I heard, and the contractor did too. That was the night I stopped laughing at the ghost stories. I wouldn't call myself a full believer, but I can't call myself a skeptic anymore either. Something was in that kitchen with us, and it wanted to be heard. Story 10. Back in my university days, I rented a room in an old rectory attached to a church in the southwest of England. It was old, cold, and drafty. The walls were thick and always felt chilly. There were 5 of us students living there, and while the house looked impressive from the outside, inside it was damp, uneven, and constantly creaking. At first, I thought it was just a quirky old house with a bit of personality. That opinion didn't last long. Even with 5 of us there, strange things happened. Doors would swing open when we were all in the same room, the heavy kind that didn't just drift with drafts. Sometimes we'd all hear footsteps pacing upstairs while we sat together downstairs. Naturally, we'd investigate, but every time we'd find nothing but empty corridors. It was unnerving, but easier to brush off when there were other people around. We'd laugh it off as the house settling or the pipes shifting, even if deep down we knew those excuses didn't fit. The real change came when summer rolled around. Everyone else went home, but I stayed behind for a temporary job. That meant I had the rectory to myself. At first, the quiet felt nice, but after a couple of days, it stopped feeling like quiet. It felt like waiting. The first week alone, things started happening almost daily. Doors slammed when I knew I had closed them. Sometimes they didn't just slam, they banged like someone had put their full weight behind them. At night, deep vibrations rolled through the house, like bass notes from a speaker turned up loud. Except there was no music, just this heavy thrum you could feel in your chest. I tried convincing myself it was trucks passing on the road or something, shifting underground, but the house shook in a way that didn't match any of that. One of the worst parts was the kitchen. I'd walk in and the cupboards would already be open, though I knew I'd closed them earlier. It happened often enough that I stopped bothering to shut them all, because it was like the house was determined to prove it could undo whatever I did. The strangest moment came one evening when I went in for a glass of water and all the cupboard doors were wide open at the same time. Not cracked, wide, as if someone had swung them open in unison. The breaking point came one night while I was watching TV downstairs. Clear as anything, I heard footsteps moving steadily across the bedroom directly above me. I muted the TV, straining to listen, and the footsteps didn't stop. They were heavy, deliberate, the kind of steps you'd hear if someone was pacing a room. I sat frozen, trying to convince myself maybe I had left a window open and it was wind shifting the boards. But then, out of nowhere, a bang exploded upstairs, like someone had slammed a door as hard as possible. My heart was in my throat, but I forced myself to run up the staircase. I expected to find someone in the house. What I found was worse. Every door upstairs, 6 in total, was wide open. I had closed them earlier in the evening. I was certain of it, and none of the windows were open, so there was no draft strong enough to explain what I was seeing. I shut every door again, trying to tell myself I was being ridiculous, that old houses do strange things. But the second I went back downstairs and settled on the couch, the footsteps started again. Louder this time, then another bang, then another. It was as if whatever was up there was mocking me for thinking I could stop it. At that point, I was too drained to run back upstairs again. I remember just sitting there staring at the blank TV screen, thinking to myself that if I acknowledged it, I'd lose my mind. So I switched the TV on and tried to drown it out. Almost immediately, the noise stopped. The house went silent again, as though it had gotten bored once I stopped giving it attention. For the rest of the summer, things never got that intense again, but they didn't go away either. Doors still moved on their own, the bass-like rumbling would shake the floor every now and then, and footsteps occasionally creaked across the hall when I knew I was the only one there. By the time my housemates returned, I had convinced myself to shrug most of it off. But deep down, I knew I had experienced something I couldn't explain. Before that summer, I would have told anyone that ghosts weren't real, that it was all exaggeration and overactive imagination. That house changed me. Maybe there are logical explanations hidden in the details. Maybe my stress and lack of sleep amplified things that weren't really happening. That's what a skeptic would say. But I know what I saw, and I know what I heard. And to this day, I can't explain it away.